Welcome to my podcast from behind the scenes at the real Downton Abbey. And today I'm sitting with a wonderful guest, Victoria Hislop, who has entranced us all with her stories about Greece. And of course, her first book, now in the library at the real Downton Abbey, was The Island, which I loved. I think I read it in a day. So, Victoria, thank you so much for joining me today. The Island was your first book, wasn't it?
Absolutely. Yes, no, very much so. I mean, I never, in my whole life, until I was 45, imagined I would write a novel. So, no, there are no kind of hidden manuscripts from, there's no juvenilia anywhere. That was it. That was my first book.
And you have lived the dream of so many other writers, such as myself, in terms that I think that book has now sold over 8 million copies in probably 30 or 40 languages.
Yes, in 40 languages.
In 40 languages.
Yes, I mean, I can't read most of them, so I have no idea even whether it's well translated. But it's led to lots of travel for me. I have been to many of those countries to promote it and to meet readers. So, yes, it was the book that changed my life, there's no doubt. And I was very, very fortunate to stumble on a place that inspired me, because it was literally that tiny island that was the starting point to telling the story.
It is an amazing book, and if you haven't read it, anyone listening, please read it. Read it again or read some of the subsequent books. But I think it has such a strong sense of place, that tiny island. And I can sort of feel in your writing the skies of Greece and the sea and the way they crossed over to the island, the seasons of it, the dryness of the air, the colours of the houses in which they lived. I think that is what meant that I couldn't put your book down.
Oh, that's a wonderful compliment, really, because I think place is a character, and I felt that since, in my own reading. I love books such as, let's say, Wuthering Heights, where the house itself is a character and it sort of influences how people behave and what they're like. And I felt, I really do feel that the climate and the light and the topography of Greece makes Greeks who they are. So I couldn't have reset that book, let's say, in the Sussex countryside. It's very much the story of a physical place. So I'm glad
of that island. And if you haven't read it, it's about where those who had leprosy were sent. So they were sent away, they were ostracized, they were isolated, and then they created a society together with a structure, and they had to welcome new inmates and bury those who sadly died, with a doctor who came to and fro. So it was an extraordinary story, which then came off the island as better cures for leprosy were found.
Yes, I mean, it is a very tough story, so I was quite, I suppose, overwhelmed by the response to it, because at the beginning it wasn't snapped up by a publisher. They didn't think, oh, this is going to be a bestseller, a story about an incurable disease. It was quite the opposite. It took quite a long time to find anyone to take an interest in it, because leprosy has a stigma attached to it. Unlike any other disease, people have a fear of it, and people with it are shunned. So it had all sorts of kind of baggage with it, the idea for the book. That eventually I found somebody who could see its potential as a story rather than a kind of portrait of a disease, because the disease is there, but it's about the way people live with it and survive. And of course it has a happy ending because the cure is found. So it was unusual, I think, right from the beginning. And maybe sometimes readers want to read something that isn't like anything else they've read, and it certainly
Had
was.
you finished the book before you took it to publishers?
No, I hadn't. I'd written a synopsis and the first 2 chapters, so they didn't have the whole thing, but the synopsis told anybody who wanted to read it that there would be a good conclusion. and that eventually people do leave if they've survived it. But on the way, important characters die. That's the reality of it. So Spinalonga, in a way, is a sort of microcosm of a Greek village, in that life is difficult. The elements play quite a big factor in your life. It's not beautiful, sunny, hot weather and blue sky all the time. There are love affairs, there are jealousies, there are children growing up. All the normal things that happen in a Greek village happened in Spinalonga. And of course, in any village, people become ill with something, and there'll be deaths and there'll be tragedies. But somehow all of this taking place on an island probably as big as this beautiful house in terms of the kind of square footage it takes up. So not a very big place for 300 or 400 people to live.
Yes, and I loved the parts of the story which were told off the island. In some ways, there was so much trauma off the island as well on the island that I found that contrast fascinating.
Yes, because of course Greece in the 30s, 40s and 50s, which are the decades that it covers predominantly, were very, very tough years in Greece. They had terrible poverty after the occupation during the Second World War, and then there was a civil war following that. So, most people lived at a very kind of basic level and were sustained by family relationships and love, and actually the church, played a big role in people's lives and their kind of ability to hope. Greek Orthodoxy was very, very much at the core of Greek society.
Yes, there are many, many chapels and churches whenever you go around Greece. I'd always wanted to go to Greece and went there possibly kind of before COVID. And we had a couple of holidays, and one not far from Spinalonga actually. So we took a boat not far from the island going around there. It is an extraordinary part of the world with so many resonances and classicism, which has been picked up in this country as well.
Absolutely.
But tending to be in the huge, grandiose architecture of an earlier civilization, rather than the humdrum daily life.
Absolutely.
Full of challenges and difficulty, which you were portraying.
Yes, I mean the classical aesthetics that we've adopted everywhere in architecture, and to such great effect, come from many, many thousands of years ago. And people often, it's an odd thing, there's a sort of big gap in the middle with Greece. You think of the strong, beautiful, fluted pillars that are everywhere you look in London, and I've seen a few while I've been sitting here in this beautiful house, or castle, I should say. And then there's a sort of gap, and then 20th century, everything has changed. They don't build like that anymore. But there was a time of, real grandeur and sort of worship of those elements of architecture that just unquestionably are beautiful. We never even think, do we? Is that an elegant portico, an elegant pillar? They just are. I think the ancient Greeks designed some of the great principles that we still love.
They had a coherence and a symmetry, and they gave us some sort of reason in the midst of muddled lives, I think.
Absolutely.
Which is what I so enjoy about it, though I'm not a Greek scholar, unlike many of my predecessors who lived here, who could have spoken, written ancient Greek, and neither my husband nor myself can, but we are surrounded by those references in some of the follies and everywhere else. So in some ways, the island, which my husband adored as well, it was such a contrast, yet we both loved it. And we're also very fond of going to visit Greece and the Greek people. And I know that you have become, the Greeks have embraced you and all your writings.
They have. They've embraced me to the extent that they've made me Greek, which was obviously in the sort of Brexit period was a great gift for me, because I have a European passport. They made me an honorary citizen back in 2020. And I have one of these funny things that we resist in this country called an identity card, where I look like a sort of resistance fighter, because you have to adopt a very serious face for your identity card photograph in black and white. And I look like probably my grandmother. And you have to carry this around with you all the time. That's a law. And then I have my Greek passport too. And I have full democratic rights as a Greek citizen, including voting. So it's strange. I feel it's a huge honour.
Do you have a house now in Greece?
I have a house, yes, absolutely.
By the sea?
Right on the sea. And to me, I love all of Greece. I've travelled extensively and spent many months, going to little towns and villages that even Greeks haven't visited, most of them. But
Has
my
your Greek
love,
improved? Are you?
Yes, I'm fluent.
Language?
I'm a fluent Greek speaker, and I started that about 10 years ago. Simply, Fiona, because I was being translated at book presentations, and I found it. I'm sure you've had this in other countries. It is an experience that just feels so uncomfortable. Somebody else saying something, you have no idea what they're saying, that is probably a bit like what you've said, but you're not actually communicating head on with the audience or with another person. And I don't enjoy this. I don't want somebody else between me and an audience, or even between me and another Greek person. And I set about learning, and now I speak, I'd say, 90% fluently. I can express anything I want to say.
Can you write as well?
I can, yes. I haven't yet. Actually, I drafted a children's book in Greek, which was very satisfying. I did a children's adaptation of The Island called Maria's Island. And I wanted, because it's written really from the point of view of a child, I felt that was about the level that I could express myself without making big mistakes. So I wrote the story as if I was an 8-year-old child, and then actually had to translate it backwards into English. So that was quite fun.
So when The Island came out, Victoria, was it immediately a huge success, or did that happen over time?
It had some very good reviews very early on, and as you know, that's always a lovely boost. And it's the thing, in a sense, that matters more than, let's say, sales, because somebody's analysis of what you've written is a very nerve-wracking moment when you suddenly
it's very personal.
Open a newspaper and somebody that you've never met and probably never will has written about your book quite kind of clinically very often. They don't know that you've almost wept over drafts and you've been exhausted with writing it and anxious and all the emotions that go with writing a book, whether it's fiction or non-fiction. It's quite a soul-searching exercise. And then somebody cool comes along and reads it and then might say something negative. But anyway, that didn't happen to me. I was nervous about it. And I had nice reviews, and then it was a sort of bit of a slow burn to begin with the hardback, and then when the paperback came out, it just seemed to have this great reception. Yes, and then it was published in Greek and lots of other languages quite quickly after that. So, yeah. But as I always say to people, I write the book once, and I'd write it the same. Every sentence would be the same, whether or not somebody said, "Oh, that's going to sell 1 million copies." It doesn't make any difference to the creative process at all. Really doesn't. So I always say to younger writers who are, worrying about whether a book will sell, I say, well, just, write it. Don't write it in order for it to be sold. You're writing it to tell a story.
Yes. And then when you'd written that book, presumably the publisher came back and said, "What's your next book?"
Yes, that is a thing, and that was
that must be quite scary too, and a good thing.
Well, I decided not to be scared,
right?
Because I thought I'm in a privileged position. People have loved this first book, and I already had an idea for another book. It wasn't as though I was gnawing the edge,
Yes.
end of my pencil off, and lying awake at night. I had an idea, so I was kind of enthusiastic about writing again, and I knew that nothing I would ever write again would sell in the same way as The Island, because that book meant so many things to so many different people and so many different things. People interpreted it in all kinds of extraordinary ways. So it's a little bit of an organic being, The Island. So my next book was about the Spanish Civil War. I thought, well, I'm not going to shy away from, people can take leprosy, they can take a civil war, sort of translated that into a fictional context. So no, I mean, I enjoy writing like you do. You could do other things. You don't have to write, but if you love it, then
I do enjoy it.
yeah, you enjoy
I lose
it.
myself in it.
It's therapy. I think writing.
But it's an emotional journey, and
Yes.
I'm crying because I'm writing the story, and I'm crying because of the effort of writing the story. It's exhausting.
Yes, it's exhausting, and yet
I
it's
had
like
no idea.
going for a long
Yeah.
walk or going for a horse ride, cantering. It's tiring. You're using your energies, but you're exhilarated by it. And it's something I always feel, if you've written and you enjoy it, it's something that's you can't not do. It's something you'd have to
Yes.
cut a bit of yourself off to stop doing.
No, I keep mulling round where I'm going next the whole time. I've always got so many ideas, and then need to focus and see what I am going to do. It's the same thing, isn't it?
It's time consuming as well. It's one of those things that if you actually add up your woman hours writing, it's disproportionate, isn't it?
Yes.
Really. But it's worth it.
So how long did The Island take you to write then, Victoria?
It took about 3.5 years from the research through to finishing and handing in the first draft. So I'm slow. I think I am quite slow, but I always have slightly on my shoulder, I think more now perhaps than I did then, the idea that I mustn't get anything that's factual has got to be right.
Yes, it has.
I can't have someone saying, "Oh, sloppy research." That to me I would say, "I'm really sorry," and I'd want to give everyone their money back for the book. So research is the bit that takes me more than longer than the writing itself.
So the book I've just finished of yours is, I think, just out, The Figurine. And again, I was unaware of Greek history. So that was because it's so embedded in the story, and the characters come out of the history, and the sharpness or the different aspects of each character come out of a specific period of Greek history, which again comes across to me very clearly, and of which I was unaware because of this gap in my knowledge of the sands that I love to walk on and the classical pillars of ancient Greece.
I think you're very typical. I mean, all of us go to Greece to escape.
Yes.
We escape so that we can see the blue skies and swim in lovely clear seas and go around the islands, and it's very idyllic. And I hope I never take away that pleasure from anybody. So it certainly wouldn't be my intention, because I love all those things.
No, you don't at all, but it's just, it enriches it because you understand more about...
Yes, the hinterland.
Yes, it is the hinterland.
Yes, and I think when I was first going to Greece in the late 70s, I knew nothing. I didn't realise that a dictatorship had only recently ended. I remember the Cyprus, that was probably one of the first political events that for some reason made a big impression on me. It was so dramatic, when, you had this priest who was the president and suddenly he was deposed, and it was on the front pages of our newspapers because of British involvement in Cyprus. But I thought, there's so much history like that in Greece that occasionally there's a massive drama and then things go back to normal, and then there'll be another one. There's always something a bit larger than life that happens every few years. And I think that dictatorship that's the background to The Figurine was something that intrigued me because it was so much within my lifetime. And ironically, the colonels, who were the people who staged the coup and began and ran that dictatorship, these three men, they believed very much in tourism, and they built a lot of those very kind of block-style hotels that are still around in Greece today. So they encouraged us all to go and lie on the beach, and they were very proud of the law and order that you found when you got there. You know, there was not much crime during that period because there were so many soldiers. So, you know, pros and cons, but mostly cons.
I mean, I've found I hadn't clocked it. Because you associate the world of Greek with democracy.
Yes,
so it
absolutely.
Was just, I was
they
reading
invented
it, and I was suddenly
they?
interested enough. I was just kind of stepping back thinking, oh my God, oh my goodness, why didn't I think about this? Because I didn't think about it at all.
For 7 years, they had no democracy,
no.
You know, until from 67 to 74, you know, no voting. People on the left were imprisoned. There was no freedom of the press. Films were censored. Music was censored. One of the great composers, Mikis Theodorakis, who wrote the music to Zorba the Greek, which is the very familiar da-dang, and he was always furious because he felt he was only known for 2 notes, and actually he wrote 1,000 musical compositions, but he was in exile. And of course, Melina Mercouri, who was such a great character, you know, she spent the whole of that period more or less out of Greece, you know, to protest, and because it wasn't safe for her to be there. So it was I think a lot of Greeks my age would remember it very in great detail, but they don't talk about it, you know. They don't. It's a bit like that thing, you know, we don't talk about the war. Obviously we do now, but I think for, you know, older generations, it was let's move on, let's forget about it.
I think I was thinking about that as well. I was thinking that sometimes when you've gone through such a huge trauma and such grief or pain or loss, that we all try to paper over it and build some scar tissue around it. It's not ignoring it, but it's just how we can continue to live. And if it's always raw and open and you're stirring it, you can't ever move on or look back at it. So I sometimes think when I'm writing, I'm choosing stories here from the past, not too close, for that very reason,
absolutely.
in order not to reignite the trauma. And I used to wonder why my grandfather was in World War II and there was never any conversation about anything there. But again, I think you've built some sort of way of dealing with it.
Yes, as a cushion between the then and the now. And it
doesn't really help necessarily to reopen it and continue to talk about it, because some of what was so awful keeps coming back too often. So that's sort of how I think of how you can deal with things like that.
Kind of a compromise, isn't it? Because I think.
But I felt your lead character, the figurine, there's a mother who left Greece because she didn't like what was going on. But again, she didn't want to keep going through it all again and again because it was going to reignite her wounds, and then bits of it float back into her life through the book. That was how I was seeing it. I think you have your own glasses on your head when you read, but that's what's so wonderful, because you paint it lightly so your own emotions can also be involved as you're reading what the characters are going through.
I hope that's how I approach it. And the mother never sits down and kind of delivers, 30 years of tough Greek history to her daughter. No. Partly because she does want her daughter to love this motherland, and to love certainly her grandmother. Yes. And I think a lot of that is based on my own upbringing and how my mother just fed me little tidbits rather than giving me too much darkness, because I think, why do that to a child? They will discover the bits that are important. And the grandchild, Helena, discovers for herself the depths of kind of evil that lie within her grandfather. So, she forms her own opinion.
But you start with some light as well, which is nice.
Yes, I have Helena arriving in Athens as an 8-year-old and just trying to see it through her eyes. I mean, it is lovely sometimes when you're writing. That's part of the joy of it. You become someone else, don't you? And you're kind of looking at the world, imagining looking at the world from a different perspective. And what could be nicer than that, really, to use the imagination.
And then have you written 6, 8 books now?
Gosh, I've written, including Maria's Island for children, I've written 9.
Wow.
Yes. Yeah, I don't know how that happened. This is time. If I divide the last years by 3, then that's roughly the number it should be.
Yeah.
So
It must have been a very different experience for your family as well, of what's happened to you as well.
Yes, I mean, the children were kind of growing up. They were 8 and 10 when I wrote The Island. And by the time they were teenagers, I think with most children, they're quite preoccupied with themselves. And then they went through university and, now they're doing their own careers. They're both actually very good writers in different ways.
And did they enjoy Greece?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, I think they celebrate how important Greece has become for me, because we all go there as a family.
Is it just you with Greek citizenship, or do they gain it as well as being related to you?
No, it's specifically for me, but I'm sure if I really campaigned but actually I don't think my husband Ian would want it. I think he would have to have you have to really desire dual nationality, because you sort of give up a little bit of the other one. I don't feel I have 2 nationalities. I feel I have half Greek, half British. I've got these 2 sides, so it is quite an emotional connection.
But what an extraordinary journey for yourself as well, from writing The Island and then becoming a Greek citizen.
No, I was on the Greek Strictly Come Dancing.
Oh my goodness, I'm so sorry I missed that. Can I find it on Google somewhere?
No, I do boast about it. It was probably my greatest achievement ever, was surviving Greek Strictly for nearly 10 weeks.
Wow.
And
how many rounds did you make it through then?
So I did 6 or 7 lives.
Crikey.
So you train, for the first few weeks and think you're never going to manage a live performance of dancing, and then you turn into this other person.
Wow.
If you ever get invited to do it. Have you ever been?
No.
Well,
I'm sure I wouldn't be.
I think...
No, I don't think so at all. But I'm very happy to Google YouTube and see you.
I can see you. It is transformative. It really is. And I think you'd look amazing in the costumes, the elegance. Costumes.
I think my sisters would have such fun and they would just cry with laughter so much.
Would they? You think so? But actually you'd wipe the smiles off their faces, I bet, after week 2.
No,
so I think that was when I felt most Greek, when I was in this huge TV studio with probably 8, they have a huge crew, 80 people produce that show, wherever it happens around the world. There were no compromise, no sort of extra help for me because I was British. That was when I was treated like a Greek. So that I think was the apotheosis of my Greek life, was being on Dancing with the Stars. And my son still does this hilarious impression of the voice that used to read, Victoria Hislop, dance the salsa. And he had this very heavy Greek accent, and William just used to find it killingly funny that there I was on Greek TV.
Yes, I imagine it must have
being spun around by this Greek guy.
And were you wearing a sparkly costume and everything?
Oh, yes, every week. Sparklier and sparklier. The sequins were flying around the room.
How amazing. How amazing.
Anyway, that's a long way away from my writing, but it's all about life and joy.
And colour. And those scenes in the island, actually, to start with dancing. I mean, it's always there.
Greek dancing, absolutely. Very significant part of particularly island culture.
Yes.
Every island has its own particular dances that are very specific and only come from there, and only the people who live there seem to be able to do them. They're very complex. Obviously, they all happen in a circle. So it's almost like you're uniting a whole... It's very symbolic, really. The whole village unites
I
in
was
a
lucky enough to go to a
circle.
school where we were taught national dancing of different countries,
Wonderful.
and one of them was obviously Greek. I've always felt very lucky. So there was, we were taught Greek dancing or Polish or different
Yes.
national dances, which was fascinating and thoroughly enjoyed it. Until the age of 11 when I went to grown-up school.
Yeah.
But we all wore these gaily coloured costumes.
Wonderful.
Amazing.
And there's no
Really,
other
really
feeling
positive.
that I
No.
think unites
Yes.
people. And we don't really do that anymore here.
Well,
And
I
there's
do
more-
Scottish dancing
do Scottish
here, Victoria.
dancing.
I
Of
love
course.
it. I do a Burns night.
Oh, do
and
you?
It is hysterical.
Oh, gosh.
And it just brings, it doesn't matter how old you are or anything
No,
else.
that's the other wonderful thing about that kind of dancing is that you can have a 4-year-old with a 94-year-old.
Precisely.
And it's very, very life enhancing.
It is very lovely.
It unifies
everyone together, and it's completely
Yes.
mad. Rather wonderful.
Marvellous.
So, Victoria, you have been so embraced by the Greek sunshine, the Greek people, and a Greek citizen. And I wonder if perhaps if there was a Greek writer who came over here and lived in Sussex or wherever, would they, do you think, be embraced by the local people in the country and be offered English citizenship?
God, that's a really tough question, actually, because there aren't really precedents for that. But I have many Greek friends who are in Britain, who've made their lives here, who are passionate Anglophiles. And the ones who've made their lives here, I've actually sponsored one of them through the citizenship process, and he is now a British citizen and very proud of it. But he had to work hard. It wasn't an honorary thing. He had to know all sorts of questions about Britain that I didn't know the answers to. But in terms of writing, I think it would be interesting to get some Greek writers
to celebrate
to
some
put-
aspect of it.
Yes, I mean, but there are absolutely for sure many Greeks who passionately love this country and see everything that's good in it, and who are possibly a bit more negative about Greece. They've really made their lives and they have no intention of going back, and they love all that Britain has to offer them, and without reservation, which I always rather love. They very often make me look at Britain in a very positive light, because they say, look at this, the transport works well. It's not working
That's a
very
strike.
well. That wasn't a good example, but they love politeness. They love the fact that we drive more carefully, that things work, and they've taught me, oddly, through their eyes, things that they love, and they love English tea in a way that the British
Probably don't notice it.
we do a bit, but not in the way that they do.
Well, I have to say, we have an awful lot of afternoon tea here, so I appreciate that a lot of people who are not English love.
And they love Downton
Afternoon
Abbey.
tea. They love Downton Abbey.
Huge fans in Greece, and my Greek friends in Britain. And of course, they think this is how life was, which is wonderful. Let them think so.
I think we all need to dream a little bit and to hope a little bit. And I've often thought that this is a little bit of a world apart in Downton Abbey. And even in a sense, when people come to visit, it's a day out, it's time away, it's time to think, to walk, to laugh, to look, to enjoy yourself before
Absolutely.
returning to the other world.
And if they were like me, and I'm saying this absolutely honestly, I shed tears as I was coming up the drive.
Oh, thank you.
As the house
thank
came
you.
into view, it completely blew me away.
It's always a privilege and a responsibility, and I never take it for granted. And I love the trees and the landscape. Quite beautiful, Victoria. So it's
very
an
special
amazing place to live, and I love walking in time and space and place. And
which is wonderful. You've shared it with the world.
well, I hope so. I
Actually.
think sharing and finding what we have in common is what's most important to me, probably. There's so many people who just, always poking their fingers at people or criticising, and that's not what should be at the heart of our lives. It's saying, hello, would you like a cup of tea?
Yeah, well, I feel most welcome here. Thank
Thank
you.
you. before I close, I was because I think I read that you're also involved now in a leprosy charity.
Yes, very much so.
Which must be very fulfilling, and I'm sure you make an enormous contribution to it.
Well, what I hope I do, obviously the fundraising is an important part of it, because although everybody thinks leprosy is a disease of the past, there are still round about 350,000 new cases a year found in the world. And those are predominantly in India and Bangladesh and some in South America. And it's completely curable. So what's happened now is that people, because of the stigma, are afraid to come forward for diagnosis. So even if you think you might have it, your family or the village where you live will ostracise you because it's still, this stigma sticks. So they don't come for diagnosis, and then that's when the associated malformities that we kind of connect with leprosy happen, you know, where you can't feel your hands, so you get blisters, you might burn a hand, and you know, you lose fingers and toes, and this is obviously catastrophic for people's lives. So we fund with Lepra doctors who actually go out into rural areas to find people who have leprosy and to teach that message that it's not a terrible thing to have it. You can be cured with a multi-drug therapy that makes you non-infectious after a few weeks. And if you can arrest it, then you don't get any of the problems that, you know, we remember from Ben-Hur and the images that we saw in that film. So it's still a lot of work to do with leprosy, and fortunately it doesn't happen in Europe anymore, but it's still a problem out there, and there are millions of people in the world damaged by it. So the goal is
mentally as well as physically too.
Absolutely, particularly for women. That's what they're finding, that there are women who are afraid or who aren't allowed to go to the clinics by their husbands because of the shame that will bring on the family. So it's something incredibly primitive and old-fashioned, you know, but the cure is there. So it's a question of teaching that message as well.
Shining the light on it so they can come out. Amazing. Victoria, thank you so much for joining me today. I love your books. Huge fan.
Well, it's wonderful
and I'm
to be
really honoured
here.
that you've come and we've explored a little bit about Greece and the island and your other books as well. And I know, obviously, they're not all about Greece, but I think of you, and obviously you are, as a Greek citizen, a real exponent from an extraordinary country, and one which I think I better understand from reading your books. So thank you.
It's a great pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Hello, it's Lady Carnarvon, and just to remind you, please do subscribe to this podcast. Then you can have it every time it comes out.